The picture is Father Lacordaire. It is in the Louvre. He changed a lot during his life, as we all do. That's when he was about 40 years old. Anyway, I'm going to give you a kind of brief biography, and then we'll get into some of his ideas. He was born Jean-Baptiste Lacordaire on May 12, 1802, near Dijon, France. On his father's side, he comes from a long line of doctors. On his mother's side, he came from a long line of lawyers. He became a lawyer. He was born in the aftermath of the French Revolution, which means that he learned very little about Catholicism as a child. The church was trying to recover from the devastation of the French Revolution, which at certain points set out to destroy Catholicism completely. When he was 12 years old, he had what he called his last religious experience before adulthood. He received the sacrament of penance and the sacrament of Holy Communion. He was a brilliant student who lost his faith in middle school. He had a teacher who greatly influenced him. The teacher was an unbeliever. But what the teacher did do for him that he never forgot was the teacher taught him the principles of the French Revolution: liberty, equality, fraternity. He never ever forgot those principles. And those principles guided his life until the very end. They got him into a lot of trouble with the church, but they're also the key to his greatness. He went to law school, and while in law school, he was influenced by a conservative Catholic group. And he made the decision to become a Catholic, a real Catholic. I mean, he was baptized a Catholic. He had received the initial sacraments, but he really didn't have a great understanding of the church at all, or the church's teachings. And this is where Romanticism comes into play. Many of the French Catholics of the 19th century were converted because of the Romantic movement. It was much more of an emotional conversion than it was an intellectual conversion with many of them. For example, Lacordaire says, "I cried and then I believed." A number of the others, very famous Romantic Catholics, also said they talk about crying. It's the beauty of Catholicism that brings them to tears, and then they become Catholics, and that's the case with Lacordaire. The heart first, and then reason follows. Anyway, he became a lawyer, became a law clerk in Paris, and he was looking forward to a brilliant law career. His mother even moved to Paris to be near him. She's very proud of her son, and she looked forward to great things. Now he's going to do something that is typical of Lacordaire. Without anybody knowing it, without consulting with anybody, he makes a major decision. He did it with becoming a Catholic. He's going to do it with going to the seminary. He decides he's going to be a priest. He's not going to go be a lawyer at all. His mother is startled, and I'm not sure she's approving of it at first. But anyway, when he goes to the seminary, Archdiocese of Paris, a lot of the people in the seminary don't like him. The Archbishop considers him to be a great catch. You've got this brilliant young man studying for the priesthood. But his seminary professors, they're suspicious of him. The other seminarians also don't tend to like him. Now, during the 18th century in France, a lot of people were attracted to the priesthood because it was a way up in the world. There were all kinds of privileges attached to it. After the revolution, there were no privileges attached to being a Catholic priest whatsoever. So what you get is a lot of, you might say, working class boys, bourgeois boys, who there's nothing really to be gained from being a priest. They're very pious. They want to be good priests. They're interested in pastoral ministry, but they tended not to be especially bright. They were very conservative. I don't know if it reminds you of anything. No, they were very conservative, and they didn't like him. They wanted the monarchy back. They didn't like the new regime at all, and that's who they were. And so he didn't fit in. And there were several times when the seminary wanted to throw him out, but the archbishop wouldn't let them. He wanted to keep him. And at one point, when he was having a lot of problems with the seminary officials, Lacordaire threatened to join the Jesuits because the Jesuits wanted him. And at that point, the archbishop says, I'm going to ordain you. And so he becomes a priest of the Archdiocese of Paris, and they have all kinds of plans for him. Maybe even give him a big job in Rome, or certainly a big job in Paris. And he says, I don't want that. I want to be a very simple priest. He becomes a chaplain at a convent, at a girls' school. He's very studious. He wants a lot of time to pray and to study. He's not at all ambitious. However, because of his romanticism, because of his interest in freedom, he's still very much committed to liberty. From the time he had that teacher at 12 years old, he loves liberty. He loves liberty, equality, and fraternity. Doesn't mean he approves of the harshness of the French Revolution, but it does mean that he thinks that liberty is perfectly compatible with Catholicism. So anyway, he wants to go to America because America was seen as the land of liberty then as now. And the Archbishop of New York, who was French, welcomed him. He wanted to make him Vicar General of the diocese or rector of the seminary. So Lacordaire was planning to go to America. Oh, by the way, just an interruption. You should all have a sheet which helps you a little bit, maybe to follow it or some of the ideas, I don't know. Anyway, just a little help. Anyway, he meets a man, a priest, named Félicité Lamennais. Lamennais is an ultramontanist, meaning that he looked to the Pope for everything. And that was a tension in the French church between the ultramontanists, who looked to Rome for everything, and the Gallicans, who saw the church as basically a French church under French control and really didn't want Rome to tell them anything to do. So anyway, Lamennais is an ultramontanist. He wanted the Pope to be the head of Europe. And he has a kind of, I don't know what you would call it. It's a retreat place. And a lot of young priests go there, people, and he kind of brings them into his ideas. He's very romantic. And the theme for Lamennais, which also becomes an important theme for Lacordaire, is God and liberty. Lamennais, like Lacordaire, wants to reconcile God and liberty. You can believe in God, but at the same time, you can believe in liberty. They're not incompatible. Many 19th century French Catholics, many 19th century Catholics saw them as incompatible. The Pope was one of those who saw them as incompatible. So anyway, he goes to Lamennais' retreat place. They work together. These are some of the things they're concerned about. They want to reconcile the church and the modern world. They want to reconcile the church and the values of the French Revolution. They start a newspaper called L'Avenir, which means the future. They advocate separation of church and state. They think the church is most free when it is separate from the state. Now, once again, that's not where most Catholics in 19th century France were, because most Catholics looked back to the days before the Revolution when church and state were united. And that was what they wanted. That was what was desirable to them. But anyway, they worked for these. They also were very much committed to the freedoms that we as Americans are used to. They advocated freedom of education, freedom of the press, freedom of religion. These are things that we take for granted. These were not taken for granted in 19th century France, especially in the early part of the century. They fought for educational freedom. They fought especially for the freedom of Catholic education, for the freedom for Catholics to have schools and to teach the Catholic faith in those schools. Now, you really needed the permission of the government for everything. And you needed the permission of the government to have Catholic schools. So anyway, this was a very controversial movement, this God and liberty movement that they started. Secular liberals didn't like it. Secular liberals didn't trust Catholics who claimed to be liberal. When Catholics say, we believe in freedom, secular liberals get real suspicious. Is this a plot? Catholics don't believe in freedom. We know that. So they don't like this. Conservative Catholics don't like this. We don't believe in freedom. Freedom is dangerous. So they got both groups against them. They also wanted to deprive priests of state salaries. Priests got a salary from the state. And Lacordaire said, we need to give up those salaries, because as long as we get those salaries, to a certain extent, we're controlled by the state. Now, the clergy didn't like the idea of giving up those salaries, so that didn't win them any friends either. So finally, they decided, we're going to go to Rome. We're going to plead our case before the Pope. The Pope was Gregory the 16th. He had been a monk. He was incredibly conservative. But they thought, because they were ultramontanists, that he would listen to them. He didn't. He suppressed the movement. In 1832, wrote an encyclical called Mirari Vos. And Lacordaire just sort of came home and said, Pope has spoken. In my heart, I'm still a liberal, but I will be quiet and do something else. Lamennais was a very proud man and he had given his complete support to the Pope. He had trusted the Pope, and he thought the Pope had betrayed him. So he became more radical as time went on, more anti-Catholic, more against the Pope. And so eventually, when he was dying, he said he didn't want anything Catholic. He didn't even want to be buried in Catholic consecrated ground, which is an amazing transformation for a man who sees the Pope as the great hope of Europe, who wants nothing to do with the Catholic Church. Now, he never really had, his brother is a blessed. He found a religious congregation. Apparently, Lamennais never wanted to be a priest. We're not sure he ever said even one mass in his life. He said he hated being a priest. So you can sort of get an indication maybe from the very beginning he wasn't too enthused. But anyway, so now this is a very providential moment for Lacordaire, because he's out of that. And then he begins his great preaching career, which he's very famous for. And the concept of providence is very important with him, because he trusts in God. He trusts that God is going to direct him, and he's able to do something, and he does it at various points in his life, that is completely different than what you expected him to do. So anyway, he starts preaching, and talks about liberty in his preaching. He preaches at a place called the Collège Stanislas. Now, it's called a college. It's really a high school, prep school. And he preaches there. And his friend Frederick Ozanam, who's a blessed, who's one of the great liberal figures in the 19th century, sort of gets in the job preaching. And you don't have high school boys coming to hear him. You have people like the writer Victor Hugo. You have Chateaubriand, who wrote The Genius of Christianity. You have all kinds of literary political figures coming to hear this person. And he's talking about liberty. And some of the priests of Paris get jealous about all of this. And they say, this man doesn't even know theology. They try to get the bishop to shut him down. So the bishop stops the college Stanislaus preaching, but he becomes the Lenten conference preacher at Notre Dame Cathedral. That is a very, very prestigious position that he's offered. And people line up early in the morning to listen to him preach in the afternoon. All of Paris is excited. Believers, unbelievers. And they're amazed that a Catholic priest understands them, understands Romanticism, understands liberty, understands the ideals of the French Revolution, can talk to them in a way that they can comprehend. He's not just giving them piety. He's not giving them simply doctrine, but he's presenting Catholicism as the answer to their problems, the problems of their society. So he does this for about 2 years, 1835-36. And at what you might call the top of his game, he decides, I'm going to quit. I'm going to quit the preaching, which once again, this is typical of him, you know. And I'm going to go to Rome. He's going to go to Rome, and he's going to study, because I don't know enough theology. I really don't. I need to study Augustine more. I need to study St. Thomas Aquinas more. And he goes to Rome, and he doesn't know what the next step is going to be after that. He's just going to go to Rome, study, pray, and hope that God tells him what to do. While he's in Rome, he starts thinking, and with the help of a famous Benedictine named Guéranger, tells him, Guéranger refounded the Benedictine order in France. And Guéranger tells him, you should refound the Dominican order in France. And he thinks about this, and it fits in with some things that have been going on in his mind. He says, if you're going to re-evangelize France, you can't do it simply with a diocesan priest. You need a religious order that has a specific mission of re-evangelizing France. Now he says, he doesn't see anybody who can do this, but he says, I don't have the gift of being a founder of a new order. He feels called to refound the Dominican order, and the Dominicans are going to be the preachers in France. So that's what he does. He writes a very famous essay, the essay on the reestablishment of the order of preachers in 1838. This is just before he comes into the order. And he writes this essay to win French public approval for his order. Now he needs this because at this time, religious orders are still, for the most part, illegal in France. Orders that do work with the poor, nursing orders, teaching orders, are okay, unless they're the Jesuits. The Jesuits have a hard time, as they always do. But the Dominicans, people didn't like friars. They didn't like monks, because they say, if you look to the 18th century, friars and monks didn't do anything. We didn't do what we were supposed to do. We just sort of had money and property and all of that. So we didn't have a good image, you know. But so anyway, he writes this essay, and he goes over the history of the order, and he talks about the freedom That is part of being a Dominican. Says you believe in freedom. Our order has a history of freedom, a history of democracy. And he goes through various people and parts of the thing. Now, he looks at the Inquisition. He doesn't apologize. He says, that was a moment when we were not living up to our ideal. His Benedictine friend, Garanger, said to him, why are you apologizing for the Inquisition? It was your shining moment. But he didn't think so. So anyway, he writes this in order to win public opinion so that even though the order will be technically illegal, the government will not do anything because they will have won popular opinion. And that's exactly what this essay does. People like the idea. The order stresses liberty. One of the things that he says is that any group of people can come together and live together and work together, except if you say your religious order. Then you can't come together. You can't live together. You can't work together. It's illegal. And he says that makes no sense if you claim liberty. Now, this was going back to before the revolution. Religious vows were approved by the state, like marriage vows are today. And so you needed state approval to lead religious life. And the state just said, we can't have that. These people are not free to come and go. And Lacordaire says, there's nothing to keep people in. If they want to leave, they can leave. The vows are between them and God. Why can't we get together and do this? Well, he wins public approval. He goes to the novitiate in Italy. And he has about 2 novices that he's recruited. And they go with him. And they are formed by these elderly Italians. Now, the fear with these elderly Italian Dominicans is that they're going nowhere. The Dominican order is going nowhere. It doesn't seem to have a future. So the order starts looking to Lacordaire and these Frenchmen as maybe the hope of the renewal. And gradually more people come and join him, including a man named Chandel, a Frenchman. I'll say something later. And he joins them. And Lacordaire is ready to go back to France, finishes his novitiate. In 1841, he goes back to France, and he preaches at Notre Dame Cathedral. And the sermon is called The Vocation of the French Nation. And he wears his habit and kappa, the black cape. Now, that is very illegal. That was very illegal to do that. But no one touched him. You had all the top government ministers were there. Anybody who was anybody is there listening to him talk. And he's a hit. And the order's reestablished. And throughout the 1840s, there's more and more houses of the order established in France. Novitiates established in France. And the order's doing very well. Then we get to 1850. And in 1850, the order was supposed to elect a new head, a new master general of the order. And the only hope that they saw was a Frenchman, because the Frenchman seemed to have had the key to renewing the order. However, Lacordaire was a controversial figure, and the Pope did not like the idea of Lacordaire being elected head of the order. So the Pope at the time, Pius IX, said that the Dominicans are not going to be allowed to have an election, and I will appoint a head of the order, a vicar provincial. And he appoints a man named Vincent Jandel. Jandel was a recruit of Lacordaire's. He hated Lacordaire. Even when Lacordaire was kind of his superior, he didn't like him because his view of the order was very different than Lacordaire's. He did not love the French Revolution. He did not like the idea of liberty. He was concerned about rules, regulations, trying to duplicate Dominic, etc. And he saw Lacordaire as mitigating it. When he's a novice, he takes a vow, and he gets some people to take it with him, that if Lacordaire changes the Constitution, they'll leave. So he really hates Lacordaire. But he becomes the head of the order. Lacordaire is appointed provincial of France. And Lacordaire continues to preach, and he continues to have a lot of influence. He gets into a fight with Gendel over the observances. Now, the Dominicans had something called the midnight office, and you were supposed to get up for prayers at midnight. Now, they had reached a kind of compromise. You could extend it until 3 in the morning. As long as you did it by 3 in the morning, it was okay. Lacordaire thought this way. He says, look, our purpose is to preach, to re-evangelize France. We're giving missions at night. We're talking to people at night. We need some sleep. We can't be getting up. Now, his compromise for us is, it's not like they're sleeping all day. They're getting up at 4 in the morning. We'll do it at 4. Well, Gendel says no. No. And he overrules him and says, you will do it at 3 or else. So they fight. And Lacordaire goes on. He becomes the head of a boys' school. He founds an order of teaching of Dominicans, brothers. He's elected to the French Academy in 1861. And he dies at 59 years old in 1861, in that year. Okay, that's now some principal themes of his thought in preaching. I don't know if I would call his preaching revolutionary, but probably is. It certainly was very challenging. It was very influential. Okay, I've already mentioned the idea of God and liberty. God and liberty is central to understanding him. What does it mean? The reconciliation of the church and the world which flowed from the revolution. From the revolution, you have liberty, you have democracy, you have a way of, you have freedom of religion, freedom of the press, all kinds of freedoms that Lacordaire is committed to. He thinks that separation of church and state is very important, that the church can only be really free if it's separated from the state. That's a very important thing for him. So this is very much a part of his preaching. And that's one of the reasons his preaching is so popular. Because he doesn't reject things that the French people, especially the French educated people, believe in. But he says you can reconcile these with our faith. There's an expression he likes, it's French, aimer son temps, to love one's time. You have to love your time. You have to love the century in which you live. You have to love your country. You have to love your society. Now, when we think of Romanticism, 19th century Romanticism, we tend to think of people looking to the past, looking to the period before the Revolution, and we think especially of people looking to the Middle Ages as the ideal. If we could only be in the Middle Ages, everything was wonderful. Everybody believed in the Middle Ages. Lacordaire had a different kind of Romanticism, which was much more typical of secular romantics than the Catholics. French Catholics looked to the Middle Ages. Lacordaire said, romanticize the moment in which you live. The moment in which you're living, that's the important time. Not the past, but right now. And he also applied this to religious life. The Dominicans were not trying to get back to duplicating Dominic in the way Dominic did it. But we're taking the ideals of Dominic and we're applying them to the present time, which was the 19th century, and we're applying it to the present needs, which is to go out and re-evangelize the church, the people. That's what we're supposed to be doing. So that's very important for him. Another quote from him. The supreme art is to know the force of the time in which one lives. The supreme art is to know the force of the time in which one lives. For him, that means we're living after the French Revolution. We're living in the 19th century in which democracy is growing, in which more and more people all over the world are demanding freedom. The Belgians are demanding democracy. The Poles were demanding freedom from the Russians. Some things still go on all the time. And it was a very dynamic period in history. And he says, we have got to love this world. And we've got to be a part of this. So that's very important. You have to know the time in which you lived. He would look at someone like Jardel and say, Jardel doesn't understand the time in which he lives. He's trying to remake the order into an earlier time. And he's making it ineffective. And it can't do what it's supposed to do. It can't re-evangelize France unless it knows where France is today and what the values of France are. Lacordaire has a dynamic, organic understanding of history, which is typical of the 19th century. Newman had it, others had it. Even though he had no historical training, he wrote a Life of St. Dominic, and it very much reflects the fact that he actually looked at documents and tried to understand Dominic as an historian would. He saw restoration as a renewal, recreation, reinvigoration. So when he talks about restoring the order, he's not talking about going to the past. He's not talking about let's go back to the way it was, but he's talking about renewal. How do we make this exciting again? How do we make this live again? That's the way Lacordaire thought. It's the way he saw the church. It's the way he saw the Dominican order. Some more aspects of his preaching. As I said, his preaching career started with Frederick Ozanam, who suggested that he gives a series of conferences to the pupils at the College Stanislaw. And Lacordaire was always concerned about the young. He was always concerned about the spiritual welfare of the young. He was always concerned about the spiritual education of the young. But as I said before, a preaching that was started for the young soon became something that all sorts of great people in Paris came to hear him. And his talks were the results of years of studies. And he had an apology for Christianity, which he tried to argue that Catholicism is very good for society. Society will allow our country to become what it should be. He had this idea that France was founded by, it was a Christian country. And France can only be true to itself when you're Christian. If you want to be a real Frenchman, he would say, and this is what he said in his Notre Dame sermons, you've got to be a Catholic, because that's the foundation of this whole thing. He studied Scripture. Scripture was important to him. Studied St. Augustine, studied St. Thomas, and he very much loved the Dominican motto, contemplata alias tradere, to share the fruits of contemplation with others. You contemplate, you pray, you meditate, you study. It's not just for yourself. You've got to go out and share it with others. That's very important to understand. And that's what he does in his preaching. But your preaching has to have that kind of basis if it's going to be effective. You can't just talk off the top of your head, for Lacordaire. He departed from 17th century preaching rules. Now, there were a set of rules that Bishop Bossuet had come up with in the 17th century for preaching. And most of the Notre Dame preachers followed these rules. And these rules led to very bored congregations. They wrote out their homilies, their sermons. They were often quite literary, but they bored people. And what Lacordaire did. He never wrote his sermons down. But he didn't preach off the top of his head. He had gone over them carefully. He knew exactly what he was going to say. Now, the reason we have copies of his sermons is that people who were in attendance would write what he was saying down. Then they would come to him later, and they would say, is this what you said? Whatever he'd look at, he said, oh yeah, that's what I said. And that's how we have copies. He didn't really write anything down. And his preaching was eloquent. He was a poet, philosopher, and he was one of them. The people realized it was one of them. It was a contemporary talking to them. He's talking about a religion that they thought was dead, and he's making it come alive. So they were impressed not just by his oratorical skills, but by his religious beliefs. And he got a lot of opposition to his preaching, especially from clergy who thought he wasn't orthodox enough. He didn't know theology enough. But he kept preaching, and people listened. He was one of them. He was a child of his age. And when he preached to people, he also tried to get across the idea. He says, you want freedom. Freedom does not begin with the French Revolution. God created us in freedom. Jesus Christ died on the cross so that we might be free. That's where freedom comes. Freedom comes from Christianity. You want to be free? Become a Christian. You want to be a real Frenchman? Become a Christian. Very important. He wasn't uncritical about the time in which he lived. He really wasn't. And he criticized certain things, and he certainly criticized the excesses of the French Revolution, but he preserved what was good. There's a story about him that most of you probably have heard of, the curé of Ars, Father St. John Vianney. And St. John Vianney lived in France, 19th century person, and he wasn't very bright and had trouble getting through seminary. And they didn't know what to do with him. So they sent him to this parish in this town called Ars, out of the way place. And it was a parish in which people didn't care about the Catholic faith or anything. Send him there, he can't do any harm there. Soon, he reinvigorated the place. His simple preaching, he heard confessions. People came from all over France to go to confession to listen to him preach. So one weekend, Lacordaire came to listen to him. And St. John Vianney was just amazed. You come to listen to me? And Lacordaire was full of praise because people, you're a real preacher. You're a real priest. And in his own way, Lacordaire was doing the same thing, a different audience, but it's the same thing that he was doing. Each of us, in our own way, is called to be a preacher. Each of us, in our own way, we're called to share our faith. But it's very important that we realize we have to know the people that we're preaching to. We have to know their beliefs. We have to know their needs, if the preaching is going to have meaning or relevance. So we thank God for Lacordaire, and we hope that his heritage will continue to live. He will continue to inspire us. Any questions? Now, somebody must have some question about this person. At least one question. Yes.
Thank you, Father Vance. Balancing, you brought up two elements: balancing the love for your own age and love for your time, and the ability to have a critical perspective or prophetic voice in your own time. And so you alluded to his prophetic critique of his time. You joined the love for his time. How did he balance that, and how can we balance
I don't know how to balance it. I really don't. As I said, he was very orthodox in his Catholicism, and so he had a great respect for the tradition. He believed you have to have a respect for the tradition, but at the same time, you have to be open to the best your culture is offering you. You don't like this whole culture wars thing. Would I think be completely anathema to him? It's you look for the best that Christianity can offer, and you use it.
There are obvious parallels between Lacordaire and Isaac Hecker.
Yes.
What are some areas where the two differ?
Oh, okay. I don't know a lot about Hecker. Other than Hecker's in an American context, so I think they're very similar. But Hecker has the whole American democratic thing that he's working with, and he's trying to. He also has this idea of the Holy Spirit. He's probably a better theologian than Lacordaire is, because the Holy Spirit's very important for Hecker in terms of what he wants to do. Follow the Spirit, and the Spirit will guide you. And you don't hear that coming from Lacordaire.
Peter, could you tell a little bit more about Lacordaire's idea of what freedom is? What is it about freedom that dignified his love of Catholicism?
Oh, okay, he gets freedom from the French Revolution. He lives in a world, the 19th century France, a world in which people are captivated by the idea of freedom, by the idea at last we can say what we want to say. We can practice what religion we want to practice. We can write what we want to write. And he believes that. He's fascinated by it. But at the same time, he thinks it has to be transformed by Christianity if it's going to be a meaningful freedom. If it's not going to be the kind of freedom that led to the excesses in the French Revolution, where people are killing each other in the name of freedom.
Well, what is it about freedom of belief? Freedom within church beliefs. What else is part of it?
Well, I would say no. I would say, I don't know. I think as a Catholic, it was really rather conservative. So I'm not sure. It's not freedom. You don't have freedom to reject church teachings, etc. He wouldn't have really been comfortable with that, I don't think. It's more freedom in society than a freedom, because he's an ultramontanist in terms of his faith. Yes.
I love the chronology was so clear, easy to follow what a complicated life in some kind of perspective. I'm curious about that conversion experience of that age 23. More feeling than intellect. Did he write about it?
He mentions it. He mentions it in his letters or whatever. He simply mentions that it's very emotional. It's not so much based on thought. He certainly thinks reason can lead you to faith, but reason is never enough. It's the heart that is the determining factor. So it's not that he rejects reason.
Just wondering which aspects of that he really did inflame him at that age. In other words, what was the emotional or the aesthetic or the spiritual pull? Was he kind of quiet about that? Was that his own secret?
Oh, okay, he read Chateaubriand's The Genius of Christianity. And Chateaubriand talks about the beauty of Christianity, the beauty of Christian liturgy, beauty of Christian music, the beauty of various aspects of Christian life. And he becomes very impressed with that. So the beauty of the structure of the church, all of that, it very much impresses him. But remember, he's a romantic. So beauty's going to really be very attractive to him in terms of this. Even though he talks about studying Augustine, he talks about studying Aquinas. I wonder how much he really did understand St. Thomas, because he never really gives any examples that I've ever found. Well, Thomas says this, and Thomas says that, or whatever. So I don't know, but okay, thank you.